So the boot fairs have started up again, which means more cheap PCs, and I've picked up another one, this time setting us back a whopping £2. Once again, this sort of thing comes with a catch. The catch in this case being that the PC doesn't actually work. So let's take a look at the broken thing we've actually bought. So this thing here is the Acer Aspire T671ME7L, which contains a Core 2 Duo E6400, the Nvidia Geforce 7500 LE graphics chip, and 2GB of DDR2 RAM, essentially making it your standard family computer from around a decade ago. These things are fairly common by now and have long since been either neglected and found new homes in either warehouses, or they've just been sent to the scrap heap. Inside, as we can see, just like the last PC I've bought from the boot fair, and every other PC anyone's ever bought from the boot fair, this thing has never had any work done to it, and there's an awful lot of dust and weird sort of substances which we won't go into inside, and one of those weird CPU cooler cones, which hasn't actually stopped all that much dust getting inside the case or the cooler. You can sort of use the clips to get it off, but I just like to use as much brute force as possible when it comes to stuff like this. With that completely off though, we need to get the power supply unit out, which has really paid for the entire value of the PC already, considering it only cost me £2, and that's about $3 for those of you in the US, so you can see where I'm coming from value-wise. Inside, it is an FSP Group 350-watt power supply unit, which will set you back about £7 or $7 online. They are really common, and locally they are everywhere. They have some great efficiency, and as we've seen in previous videos, they can power the likes of a GTX 465, which is a bit power hungry to say the least. It goes without saying though that the motherboard is just a generic Acer one. It supports a few CPUs more than this, but generally no Core 2 quads, which really limits its uses in 2018. It supports most of the 6 series Core 2 Duos though, and even has some heatsinks on the VRMs, which isn't actually for the Core 2 Duos. It's in case you want to downgrade back to a Pentium D, which unfortunately will actually work. Unfortunately, I have a feeling though that this PC doesn't turn on. Well, we know it doesn't turn on, but we need to get the entire thing out and test why it doesn't. So let's test the motherboard and set it up on this little system, and as we can see, it doesn't post or even turn on. So what I'm going to do is give it a bit of a spray down, as it looks like some of the thermal paste has got onto the board, which might be causing some interference, and I've known little things like this to cause issues with PCs like this in the past, and it just tends to happen. So what you could use is isopropyl alcohol. But I don't have any of that, so I've just used cheap aftershave, which I don't really recommend doing, but it works alright and I didn't have anything else to hand, and our board actually booted up after that, so yeah, it was just some dirt on the board, and that's likely why this PC ended up being sold so cheap. Generally, this PC was just dirty, and that's the main thing wrong with it. And well, how do you deal with a dirty PC? Well, you treat the valuable parts quite nicely, and their case you just give a nice dollop of soap to and a bucket full of water, which seems to be my go-to on dirty cases nowadays. But as you probably guessed, the reason I want this case nice and clean is that they actually have quite a lot of reuse value. They offer decent build quality and good expandability, and they'll make a decent sleeper build on the channel at some point. And that would probably make it the 4th video I've done featuring this case, as I did unfortunately sell the other case I had, but now I have one in a bit of a better state. But that's enough about cleaning this Acer. Let's get this hunk of junk back together and ready for some benchmarks. I did however manage to get an overclock on the GPU, nothing spectacular as otherwise the card crashes, and the memory is limited. So in other words, the card's so locked down that the performance you're going to see is pretty much the exact same as every 10-year-old PC. And in fact, a PC like this will cost you under £10 on eBay, and probably the same as that in dollars or euros, as these things are absolutely everywhere. Find one at the tip or cheap at the bootfair or the flea market. And in terms of day-to-day tasks, web browsing and everything along those lines, you'll be perfectly fine. In fact, Discord and everything like that is flawless on this machine. Some multitasking was possible, but a little bit sluggish, and YouTube was not playable in 1080p, although was possible with the H.264 add-on, however I don't have footage of that to show you. And anyway, let's get on with some proper gaming benchmarks. First up, we have Half-Life 2, which we ran with low settings in 1280 by 800. You'll have to forgive me filming the screen, but it wouldn't actually let me capture any display output from the 7500LE. I've tried multiple drivers, different display outputs, adapters and everything, and I just couldn't get it to be able to be captured. But I've just gone with filming the screen, and we had a pretty flawless experience with this game. But for some reason though, setting the settings any higher will actually cause our FPS to plummet below the 30 FPS region. So I opted for this decent resolution with these settings for a nice high FPS, as I'm guessing this card doesn't exactly play nice with these types of games as it is an OEM variant. With or without an overclock made no difference, and trust me, I think it's just a driver or card related bug probably. Banished is a fairly recent game, and even with the low settings and our resolution of 1280 by 800, we saw 47 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 34 FPS and 0.1% lows down to 25 FPS. Of course, it's worth noting that I did only build a small little village, and anything larger than this may actually cause issues, but using the small map size did help performance, and only building a small town did also help performance, but it may struggle in the late game. Minecraft pretty much runs on all PCs, so even with the 900p resolution and the fast option selected, we saw absolutely fine and playable settings, but we did have clouds disabled. We saw 40 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 30 FPS and 0.1% lows of 12 FPS when the game was loading in. Definitely playable, although the 2GB of RAM is restricting, as well as the Core 2 Duo and even the likes of the Geforce 7500LE, which, well, really all struggled in unison. And the experience was playable, but I'd recommend steering away from any graphically intensive mods. I'm surprised CSGO started, but even in 480p with the lowest option selected, we saw a return of 16 FPS on average, with some heavy frame drops constantly down to 1% lows of 3 FPS and our 0.1% lows of 1 FPS. It was far from playable, and sure, with some tweaks you might be able to get it somewhat playable in around the 30 FPS region, but really that GPU is quite the limit. And we've seen in my other videos that the Core 2 Duo doesn't hold up spectacularly well in CSGO today either, thanks to how bloated the game has become. Civ 5 was unplayable, as all the parts got stressed to the max, the RAM was full, the GPU was maxed out, and even our poor little Core 2 Duo wasn't exactly holding up very well in this title. Sure, in the strategy mode it was somewhat playable, but even then in the late game will slow down heavily, and realistically you want to play the game the way it was designed. And even then our averages of 12 FPS, 1% lows of 4 FPS and 0.1% lows of 1 FPS pretty much tell you that you can't play it that way, and you're better off playing one of the classics like Civilization 3 or Civilization 4. Mountain Blade Warband with the low settings in DirectX 7 mode returned us with a very fluent figure of 70 FPS on average, but this game will very literally run on a toaster. Oddly enough though, once again, higher settings resulted in a completely unplayable experience, and I'd have to say VRAM is to blame, but then again I've tested cards that are worse than this and have less VRAM, and even then they weren't as badly affected. So your best bet if you can find a system like this is to actually investigate the GPU further, which I might actually do in a separate video to see if it's just the pairing with this computer or whether it's the graphics card by itself. Rimworld ran alright with an average of 29 FPS, which was brought down heavily by the world selection screen, which was painful to even attempt to use. However, in actual gameplay, as you can see, it ran completely fine. I didn't play with the largest map sizes, and the Core 2 Duo may struggle a little bit, but the 1% and 0.1% lows of 4 FPS weren't great on the world selection screen. But that was pretty much where the only issue was, so this game gets a pass for playability, despite the average reading result figures. The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, while running in 480p with the lowest option selected, saw a return of 12 FPS on average, which is pretty much on par with the PS3 in the late game. But moving aside from that, the game ran pretty awfully. I'm surprised it started, but the lighting decided to play up, almost as if all of Tamriel became a giant disco ball. And finally, the age-old question of can it run Crysis? And no, it just can't. In fact, it's actually so bad that the question is more, can it start Crysis? But once we actually got into game, we saw 13 FPS on average, which was horribly fragmented down to the 1% lows of 5 FPS and the 0.1% lows of 2 FPS. We saw that in fact the game did start, but I doubt you'll get very far in the game when it plays very similarly to that of a PowerPoint. As for recording, you can get away with a little bit with 480p 30fps in games like Half-Life 2, offering you the best visual quality that you can get in a recording. However, you can reduce these settings down a little bit and use something like 60fps recording should you want to, but do keep in mind that I had to reduce the bitrate settings in low and able to be achieved these kinds of recordings, so it'll be your choice if you want the frame rate or the quality when it comes to recording on a PC like this, not that I really recommend doing without hardware encoder anyway. Emulation-wise on the machine, you can pretty much run everything up to the PlayStation 1 at full speed, but going any further than that into the GameCube or Wii territory is just a tad too far on a little chip like this. You might be able to push it down and get it to work, but realistically it's not going to be an enjoyable experience, and I'd recommend staying well away from that generation of consoles in terms of emulation. As for Steam streaming though, on PUBG we saw a fairly decent experience. However, the game did lower its bitrate due to a lack of decoding power on the graphical and processing sides, as when I tested this on a laptop I saw much better results due to the way the newer graphics cards handle the likes of Steam streaming, and that wasn't even on a wired connection, so it's definitely not a network issue here. However, it was playable, but the bitrate was a little bit of a downside and the decode times weren't exactly ideal and did push up the latency a tad. But at a push, you could stream some games to your TV in the living room by using an old PC like this. Not that it's exactly space efficient, power efficient or quiet, so in all honesty I'd recommend steering well away from that. So in conclusion, the £2 PC Mark II is just about as good as the original. In fact, it virtually is just the Core 2 Duo version of the exact same PC. Both of them were covered in dust, cobwebs and assorted dirt, but they both cleaned up quite nicely and eventually worked with the cleanup. And they're available everywhere. I mean, I've picked up 2 of these already. This one was a bit more powerful with a dedicated graphics card, but performance was similar nonetheless, and it beats the horrible creation that PC did eventually become, for anyone that actually remembers that. So for those 10-year-old family desktops, should you buy them? Well, probably not, because frankly they don't game too well, and there's little you can do upgrade-wise for most of them. But for an extremely low budget, check your local flea markets, boot fairs and selling sites, and chances are you'll find something. In fact, just check the bins, because people are just throwing these things away nowadays. Thank you very much for watching. Good night! So if you thought this finding was good, it was probably my best value finding at the boot fair so far. But then again, I've picked up something quite rare and unique, which should make for a fun little video for the next time. So stay tuned for that, and I'll catch you guys then.